It all started with this random flyer stuck to a lamppost. I was walking back from the store, minding my own business, when I saw it flapping in the wind. It caught my attention because it was bright red, like someone really wanted people to notice it. Free circus tickets for the grand opening of Twisted Smiles, it said in these big, bold letters. Now, normally I just ignore something like that, but the word free hooked me in. And to be honest, I was bored out of my mind. Broke too. It felt like the universe was giving me a nudge, like, hey, here's something to do that won't cost you a dime. So, I took a picture of the flyer and shot a text to my group chat. Yo, free circus tonight. Y'all in? Kyle, who's always down for something weird, texted back almost immediately. Hell yeah. His girlfriend, Lisa, wasn't as enthusiastic but agreed to come along. I could practically hear her rolling her eyes through the screen. But honestly, I didn't care. We needed a distraction. Something different. That evening, we met at the old fairgrounds where the circus was set up. I hadn't been to that part of town in years. Not since the fair had shut down. The place always had this abandoned, rundown vibe, but tonight it felt worse. The gates were rusty, the sign was barely hanging on, and there was this weird fog creeping along the ground. Kyle was already there when I arrived, leaning against his car, with Lisa scrolling through her phone like she'd rather be anywhere else. Dude, this place looks sketchy as hell, Lisa muttered, not even looking up from her phone. Kyle grinned, ever the thrill seeker. That's the point, babe. Creepy circus, free tickets. What's not to love? I chuckled, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled in my gut. Let's just go inside. It's probably all part of the show, right? They're going for that whole creepy horror vibe. Kyle pushed open the gates, which creaked so loud it made us all jump a little. Ladies first, he said, gesturing for Lisa to go in. She glared at him, but walked through anyway, and the rest of us followed. Inside, the fairgrounds were dead quiet. No carnival music, no crowd, just this eerie silence hanging in the air. The main tent, which should have been filled with people, was completely empty. The whole thing felt wrong, but I didn't want to be that guy who freaks out first. So, I played it cool, even though my heart was starting to race a little. We walked towards the entrance of the big top, and that's when we saw him. A single clown, standing dead center in the middle of the ring. He was dressed in this old-fashioned clown outfit, like straight out of a black and white movie or something. His face was painted with a huge smile, but his eyes, there was something off about his eyes. They were dark, almost hollow, like he wasn't really looking at us, but through us. Welcome to Twisted Smiles, he said in this raspy, almost metallic voice. It sent chills down my spine. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, smiling that unnerving smile. Lisa grabbed Kyle's arm. I don't like this. We should leave. Kyle, trying to keep the mood light, laughed. It's just part of the act, Lisa. Come on. It's supposed to be creepy. I tried to back him up, but honestly, I was starting to get second thoughts too. Something about that clown, something about the whole place felt wrong. But we had already come this far, and leaving now felt stupid. So, we found a spot in the bleachers and sat down. There were dozens of empty seats, and the whole tent felt massive with just the three of us in there. The clown disappeared behind a curtain, and we waited. At first, we were just sitting there in silence, unsure if anything was even going to happen. Kyle kept looking around like he was waiting for a big reveal, while Lisa stared at the exit like she was ready to bolt at any second. I was stuck somewhere in between, curious but also ready to run if things got too weird. Minutes passed and still nothing. Just that heavy, uncomfortable silence. I was about to suggest that we leave when the lights flickered. When the lights flickered, I thought maybe the show was finally starting. But instead of the usual circus fanfare or flashy performers, it was just darkness. The tent felt suffocatingly quiet, and for a second, I wondered if the whole thing was a joke. Some kind of prank to mess with the few suckers who showed up. I was about to say something to Kyle when, out of nowhere, the lights came back on, but not in the way you'd expect. Instead of the whole tent lighting up, there was just this dim glow like someone had turned on a single old light bulb in the middle of the tent. And standing right there in that faint light was the clown from before. Only this time he wasn't alone. 5 more clowns had appeared. They were just standing there, not saying a word, perfectly still like creepy statues. They were all dressed differently, but the weirdest thing was their faces. Each one had a different expression painted on. There was one with a sad frown, another with an angry scowl, one with wide eyes like he was surprised, another that looked confused, and one that had a straight, expressionless face. None of them moved. They just stood there, staring at us like they were waiting for something. Kyle leaned over to me, trying to act like he wasn't freaked out. "Dude, this is some next-level performance art or something." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too focused on the clowns. The way they stood there, completely still, was more unsettling than if they'd been moving around. Lisa, on the other hand, had clearly had enough. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I don't care if this is some artsy show," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm leaving. This isn't right." She started walking toward the entrance, and that's when it happened. The tent flaps, which had been open when we came in, slammed shut all at once. No wind, no one pulling on them, they just shut like someone had flipped a switch. The sound echoed through the tent, making all three of us jump. Kyle stood up, trying to stay cool, but I could see the unease on his face now. "Okay, that was weird," he muttered. He jogged over to the entrance, yanking at the flaps. They didn't move. He pulled harder, then used both hands, but they wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he growled, pulling harder. The fabric felt almost solid, like it had somehow turned into steel. Lisa, now in full panic mode, rushed over to Kyle. "What's going on? Why can't we get out?" Her voice was shaky, and she kept glancing back at the clowns, who hadn't moved an inch. I was still sitting in my seat, staring at them. Something about the whole scene felt wrong, like we weren't just trapped, we were being watched. The clowns' painted expressions didn't change, but there was this energy in the air, this feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Then, without warning, the first clown, the one with the huge smile, moved. It wasn't a normal movement, though. It was jerky, unnatural, like someone had just yanked on invisible puppet strings. His head tilted to the side, and his smile, already too wide, somehow stretched even further across his face. The others began to move too, each in their own unsettling, twitchy way. Kyle let go of the tent flaps and backed up, his face pale. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," he said, his voice tight. The clowns started to spread out, forming a wide circle around us, moving so slowly it was almost torturous. Their eyes, the only part of them that didn't seem fake, were locked on us the whole time. I couldn't help but notice how dark and empty those eyes were. It felt like staring into a void. Lisa grabbed Kyle's arm, practically clinging to him now. "We have to get out of here. Kyle, do something." "I'm trying," Kyle snapped, but it was clear he didn't know what to do. None of us did. We were trapped, surrounded, and the clowns were closing in. I finally stood up, my legs shaky. "Maybe it's all part of the act," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. What kind of act seals you in a tent with a bunch of freaky clowns? The ringleader, who we hadn't noticed until now, suddenly stepped out from behind the curtain. He wasn't dressed like the others. In fact, he wasn't dressed like a clown at all. He had on this long black coat, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. There was something about him that was even more unnerving than the clowns. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice deep and echoing through the tent. "Welcome to the main event." That's when the clowns really started to move. The moment the ringleader's voice echoed through the tent, the atmosphere shifted from eerie to downright terrifying. His deep, booming voice carried a strange weight to it, almost like it wasn't just sound but something that grabbed hold of you, pulling you deeper into whatever nightmare this was. The clowns, who had been slowly spreading out, now began to move with purpose. They weren't walking anymore. No, they were gliding. Their feet barely seemed to touch the ground as they circled around us, like predators playing with their prey. My heart was racing. I didn't know whether to run, scream, or just stand there and hope it was all a twisted joke that would end any second. But I couldn't move. None of us could. "Let the show begin," the ringleader declared, snapping his fingers with a sharp crack that echoed through the entire tent. Suddenly, the lights in the tent began to flicker wildly, casting long shadows that danced around the clowns' faces, making their painted expressions shift and warp in the dim light. Each flicker seemed to make the clowns appear closer than they had been a moment before. I could feel Lisa clutching in my arm now, her nails digging into my skin. She was shaking uncontrollably, but her voice was frozen in her throat. Kyle, on the other hand, was staring wide-eyed, his usual bravado completely gone. One of the clowns, the one with the grotesquely exaggerated frown painted on its face, started to perform. But it wasn't juggling or riding a unicycle like you'd expect in a circus. No, this one pulled out a knife, a long, gleaming knife, and began flipping it in the air, catching it with eerie precision. The blade made a whoosh sound as it sliced through the air, each flip catching the flickering light, sending glints of silver across the tent. He never took his eyes off us as he performed, and I swear, I saw something move beneath the painted frown on his face, like his real mouth was trying to break free from the fake expression. Kyle took a step back. What the hell is this? His voice cracked, fear finally slipping through the cracks of his bravado. Before I could answer, another clown, this one with wide, bulging eyes and a surprised expression, started to spin around in circles. At first, it was almost funny the way it twirled like a little kid pretending to be dizzy. But then it started spinning faster and faster, its movements jerky and unnatural. The air around it began to feel wrong, like it was charged with electricity or something. Its arms flailed out, long and lanky, almost too long for its body, like they'd been stretched by something unnatural. Lisa whimpered beside me. "I want to go home," she whispered, tears spilling down her face. I didn't know what to say. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that we could just leave, but the truth was, I wasn't sure we could. We were surrounded, trapped in this twisted nightmare of a circus. The ringleader walked to the center of the ring, his footsteps silent, his dark eyes never leaving us. He raised both hands in the air, as if commanding the attention of the clowns, and they all stopped moving at once. The silence that followed was suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could hear Kyle breathing heavily next to me. The ringleader smiled, his teeth sharp and too white. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice soft but mocking. "You came for a show, didn't you?" No one answered. What could we even say? This wasn't a show. This was a nightmare. The clowns started to move again, but this time they didn't perform. They began to close in on us, slow and deliberate. The knife-juggling clown still had the blade in his hand, twirling it between his fingers as he came closer. The one with the surprised face kept spinning, but now it was inching towards us, its eyes locked on Lisa. Another clown, the one with the straight face, was dragging something behind it, a massive hammer, the kind you'd see in an old-fashioned carnival game, but this one was covered in dark, wet stains. Kyle snapped. "Screw this," he yelled, grabbing Lisa by the arm. He darted towards the exit again, but the tent flaps were still shut tight, as if sealed by some invisible force. He yanked at them, harder this time, his muscles straining, but it was like pulling on solid rock. "Kyle!" Lisa cried, tears streaming down her cheeks as she yanked her arm free, backing away from the approaching clowns. She was hyperventilating now, her eyes wide with pure terror. I was frozen, staring at the ringleader as he tilted his head, watching us with an almost amused expression, like we were his favorite part of the performance. "It's no use," the ringleader said, his voice dripping with dark amusement. "You can't leave until the show is over." "What does that even mean?" I shouted, my voice shaky. "We didn't ask for this." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "But you did, didn't you? You came here, didn't you? You wanted to be entertained. And so you will be." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something off about the way he spoke, like there was no escape, no option but to play along with whatever sick game this was. The clowns were inches away now, their smiles growing wider, more distorted, their eyes dark and empty. Then suddenly one of the clowns reached out. Its hand was cold, too cold, as it brushed against my arm, and that was it. Instinct kicked in, and I bolted toward the center of the tent, away from the clowns. Kyle followed suit, dragging Lisa behind him, and we found ourselves huddled in the center of the ring, surrounded on all sides by the grinning, twisted faces of the clowns. The ringleader clapped his hands once, and everything stopped. The clowns froze, mid-step, their arms extended toward us, their expressions locked in place. He stepped forward, lowering his voice to a whisper that still somehow filled the whole tent. The show has begun, and now, the fun really starts. Kyle was the first to break. He sprinted back toward the tent flaps, determined to escape. "Come on, these have to open," he shouted, his voice tight with fear. He grabbed the thick canvas and yanked with all his strength, but it didn't even budge. He threw his entire weight into it, pulling, kicking, even trying to rip at the seams, but nothing happened. The tent flaps might as well have been welded shut. Lisa was right behind him, pounding her fists against the fabric. "Let us out," she screamed, her voice cracking as tears streaked her face. Her hands trembled, smudging the makeup running down from her eyes, making her look almost as unsettling as the clowns surrounding us. I stood there, frozen, watching them struggle with that ridiculous canvas while the clowns stood silently, just staring. They were still, but their presence was suffocating, like shadows creeping closer and closer. There was no music, no laughter, not even a whisper of wind. Just that heavy, crushing silence. Kyle turned, his eyes wild. "Dude, help me." He waved me over, desperate. "We can break through if we hit it together." I hesitated for a moment, glancing at the clowns. They hadn't moved yet, but I could feel them watching, like they were waiting for us to make a wrong move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I forced myself to run over to him. Together, we threw ourselves against the flaps, pushing and pulling with everything we had. Still nothing. The material felt like it was fused with something stronger than fabric. It didn't make sense. This was supposed to be a tent, for crying out loud. But it was like the laws of reality didn't apply here. Kyle stepped back, panting, his hands on his knees. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "This isn't normal. This isn't." Before he could finish, the ringleader's voice echoed through the tent, calm and almost playful. "The show isn't over, dear guests. The fun has only just begun." I whipped around to see him, standing in the middle of the ring again, his pale face grinning like he had all the time in the world. The clowns began to move again, slowly, like they were savoring every moment. Their heads tilted, faces still locked in those grotesque expressions as they started to close in on us. Lisa's sobbing grew louder as she stumbled away from the flaps. "We need to get out of here," she cried, her voice barely a whisper now. "Please, someone help us." Kyle, his hands trembling, grabbed her by the shoulders. "Calm down," he said, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than her. "We're gonna get out of this, okay? We just need to think." But there wasn't time to think. The clowns were closing in fast, their footsteps eerily quiet despite their heavy shoes. The knife-juggling clown was still flipping his blade effortlessly in the air, his painted frown somehow more sinister up close. The spinning clown, its eyes wide with fake surprise, was wobbling toward us, almost too fast now. The one with the hammer dragged the enormous thing behind it, the wet stains on it glistening under the dim lights. I backed up, my eyes darting around, looking for some kind of escape, but everywhere I turned, there were clowns. "This isn't part of the act," I shouted, my voice rising in panic. "We need to go now." I grabbed Kyle's arm and pulled him back toward the center of the ring, hoping, praying, that somehow sticking together would keep us safe. Lisa followed, her breath ragged, barely holding it together. The ringleader smiled wider, if that was even possible. He raised one hand, and the clown stopped. Just like that, they froze again. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or if it just meant something worse was coming. He began walking toward us slowly, deliberately. His boots didn't make a sound on the dirt floor. It was like he floated over the ground, eerily graceful. "You see," he began in that soft, almost hypnotic voice, "the problem with most people is they don't appreciate a good show. They want entertainment, but they never want to pay the price." He circled us, his eyes glinting with something dark. "But you're different. You came here willingly, didn't you? You wanted something exciting. We didn't want this." Lisa screamed, trembling so hard she could barely stand. Kyle stepped forward, trying to shield her, but I could see the terror in his eyes. "Look, man, just let us go. We didn't sign up for whatever this is." The ringleader chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Ah, But you did. You entered the tent. You sat down. And now, you must see it through. His grin grew wider, teeth too sharp, too perfect. The show must go on. As soon as he said it, the clowns began moving again. Only now, their movements were faster, more deliberate. The hammer clown lifted his massive weapon over his shoulder, the metal head dragging through the dirt, leaving a trail behind it. The spinning clown stopped spinning and just stared, its head tilted almost completely sideways, like it didn't understand why we were afraid. Kyle grabbed a piece of wood from one of the broken benches, holding it like a bat. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The ringleader just laughed. "You can't fight them, my dear boy. They are merely the actors in my little show." He gestured to the clowns, who inched closer, their eyes never leaving us. "They won't hurt you, unless you try to leave before the finale." "Finale?" I stammered. "What's the finale?" The ringleader leaned in, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like rotting meat, and his eyes, there was nothing human left in them. "Why? The part where you learn what happens to those who don't finish what they started." Lisa was sobbing uncontrollably now, and even Kyle was losing it. "There has to be a way out," he shouted, swinging the wood at the nearest clown. It hit the sad-faced clown square in the chest, but instead of crumpling, the clown just stood there, as if the wood had bounced off an invisible wall. It tilted its head at Kyle, almost like it pitted him. The ringleader clapped his hands again, and the clown stopped once more. The sudden stillness made the air feel thick, like we were suffocating under it. The ringleader stepped back, hands raised like he was some kind of twisted magician. "It's simple," he said, his voice calm but menacing. "All you have to do is enjoy the show." He snapped his fingers, and the clowns resumed their slow, predatory movements, closing in on us again. That's when I realized we were never supposed to leave. Not until the show was over. But what did that mean? How long would it go on? What did they want from us? Kyle, his voice desperate, shouted, "We have to fight them. We can't just sit here." But as the clowns drew nearer, I began to understand. There was no fighting them. There was no breaking out. The ringleader had made that clear. We had to play along, finish whatever twisted game this was, or we wouldn't leave at all. As the clowns moved closer, I could feel the air grow thicker with tension, like the whole tent was alive with this suffocating energy. Every instinct I had was screaming to run, to fight, to do something, but nothing was working. We had no way out, no plan, no understanding of what was happening. The ringleader was still standing there, watching us with that unsettling grin, as if he already knew how this would end. Lisa had collapsed to her knees, shaking uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands. Kyle, still gripping that broken piece of wood, stood over her, his chest heaving with every labored breath. He was trying to look strong, like he was going to protect her, but we all knew he was just as terrified as the rest of us. The clowns were closer now, their painted faces looming in the flickering light. They didn't make any noise, didn't laugh or speak. They just stared, their grotesque smiles frozen, their eyes dark and empty. One of them, the clown with the exaggerated frown and the knife, flipped his blade one last time before catching it in his hand and pointing it directly at me. The cold metal of the blade seemed to shimmer in the low light, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Kyle raised the wood again, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Stay back. I'm warning you." He swung wildly at the clown with the knife, but the clown moved so fast it was like he blurred, dodging the swing effortlessly. Kyle stumbled forward, barely catching himself before he fell. The clown just tilted its head, watching him with this eerie calm, like it wasn't in any rush. "They're playing with us," I muttered under my breath, finally putting the pieces together. "This whole thing, it's all part of the act." Kyle turned to me, his eyes wide with desperation. "What the hell are you talking about?" I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it myself. "Look at them," I said, pointing to the clowns. "They're not attacking us. They're just circling. It's like they're waiting for something." The ringleader said we had to finish the show. Remember? Kyle shook his head, confused. "What does that even mean? Finish the show? We didn't start anything." I glanced at the ringleader, who was watching us with a bemused expression, clearly enjoying our confusion. I don't know, I admit it, but I think we're part of the show now. Like, we're the main act. Lisa finally lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do they want from us?" I looked back at the clowns, then at the ringleader. It hit me like a punch in the gut. We have to play along? That's the only way we're getting out of here. Kyle's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Play along? With these things?" He gestured to the clowns, who were still inching closer, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. "Think about it," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "Nothing we do is working. We can't fight them, we can't escape, and the ringleader keeps talking about how we have to finish the show. If we don't, we're stuck here. Forever." Kyle opened his mouth to argue, but then he looked at the clowns again. The hammer-wielding one dragging its massive weapon closer, the knife clown spinning the blade between its fingers, and something in him seemed to break. He lowered the piece of wood, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "So what? We just let them do whatever they want?" he asked, his voice hollow. I shook my head. "No, we give them what they want. A performance." Lisa wiped her face, trying to pull herself together. What kind of performance? I had no idea, but as I racked my brain, I remembered the flyer, the one that started this whole nightmare. I pulled it out of my pocket, the crumpled piece of paper now almost unreadable in the dim light. But at the bottom, in tiny, faded print, I could still make out the words, "The show must go on." The show, I muttered, staring at the flyer. That's what it's all about. They're expecting us to play along, to perform. Kyle ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "This is insane. They want us to perform? Like what? Juggle? Do tricks? How are we supposed to do that?" The ringleader, as if he'd been waiting for his cue, stepped forward, his voice dripping with amusement. "Oh, don't worry. You'll know what to do when the time comes." The clowns stopped moving, all of them turning their heads toward the ringleader in unison, as if he had given them some silent command. The tension in the air thickened, and I could feel a knot of dread twisting in my gut. Lisa stood up slowly, still shaking, but her eyes were clearer now. "So, we perform, we give them a show, and then we can leave? That's what you're saying?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. It's the only thing that makes sense. We play their game. We give them what they want. Kyle threw his hands up in frustration. "And what if it doesn't work? What if this is all just some sick game, and they kill us anyway?" I didn't have an answer for that. We don't have any other options, man. We either play along, or we keep running in circles until they get tired of us. The ringleader clapped his hands, drawing our attention back to him. "That's the spirit," he said with a wide grin. "Now let's get the show started properly, shall we?" With another snap of his fingers, the lights in the tent brightened slightly, and the clowns began to retreat, spreading out to form a wide circle around us. The ringleader stood at the edge of the ring, watching us with those dark, hollow eyes. "Your performance," he said, "begins now." The clowns, now at a distance, stood perfectly still, their grotesque expressions frozen in place. It was as if they were waiting for us to do something, but I had no idea where to start. My mind raced, trying to come up with some kind of plan, some way to appease whatever twisted rules this circus had. Kyle looked at me, his face pale. "What do we do?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "We give them a show. We pretend. We act like we're in a circus. Maybe that's all they want. Just a performance." It sounded ridiculous, but what choice did we have? "Okay," Kyle said, his voice shaky. "Let's do it. Let's give them a show." I had no idea if this would work, but I knew one thing for sure. It was the only chance we had left. And so, with the ringleader watching, the clowns waiting, and the entire twisted circus bearing down on us, we prepared to give the performance of our lives. Our survival depended on it. The moment we stepped into the ring, I could feel the weight of the eyes on us. The clowns, the ringleader, the tent itself, all seemed to pulse with a life of their own, expecting us to perform. But I had no clue what to do. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them making any sense. How do you perform when your audience is a bunch of nightmare clowns and their sadistic puppet master? Kyle, still holding on to that broken piece of wood like it was going to save him, turned to me. "Okay," he whispered, his voice low and shaky. "What now? How do we even start?" I didn't have a plan. Nothing made sense. But I could feel the pressure building, like we had to do something or the clowns would snap into action again. "I don't know," I muttered. "We just act. Like it's a circus. We give them a show," like he said. "Act?" Kyle scoffed, panic rising in his voice. "I'm not an actor, man. This is insane." Lisa, who had been silent for a while, suddenly stood straighter. "What if we play along with the roles they want us to fill?" Her voice was soft, like she wasn't sure of her own idea. "Like, pretend we're part of the circus?" Kyle looked at her like she'd lost it. "Pretend? Lisa, we're surrounded by murderous clowns. You want us to play circus? This isn't. Do you have a better idea?" She shot back, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of clarity. "Because I'm all out of ideas. We have to do something." I nodded, even though my mind screamed that this was beyond stupid. "Let's just try it," I said. "We don't have any other options." The clowns were still standing, watching us with those horrible, painted-on expressions, their dark eyes glued to our every move. The knife-juggling clown was flipping his blade between his fingers again, as if he were waiting for us to mess up. "Okay, fine," Kyle said, clearly out of his depth, but willing to try anything. "What do we do first?" I scanned the area around us, looking for something, anything, that could help us perform. There were a few broken benches scattered near the edges of the tent, and some ropes hanging from the poles that held the canvas up. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. I walked over to one of the benches and grabbed a piece of rope. "Let's make it look like we're putting on a show," I said. "Kyle, act like you're the strong man. Lift one of the benches, do some kind of stunt." Kyle blinked at me. "Are you serious?" "Just do it," I snapped, my nerves frayed. "Lisa, I don't know, maybe you could be the acrobat?" Lisa looked at me, her face pale but determined. "Acrobat? I can't even do a cartwheel." I handed her one of the ropes. "It doesn't matter. Just swing around, make it look convincing. If we can trick them into thinking we're part of the circus, maybe they'll let us go." The idea sounded crazier out loud, but we didn't have a choice. Kyle reluctantly grabbed one of the benches, struggling to lift it over his head. He wasn't weak, but fear had taken most of his strength. Still, he managed to hoist it up and started flexing his muscles like he was some kind of carnival strongman. "Tada," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Lisa took the rope and awkwardly swung it over one of the tent poles. She climbed up a few feet, her movements shaky but determined, as if she were trying to channel some long-lost gym class skills. She glanced down at me, her face filled with doubt, but I gave her a nod, trying to encourage her. And then I just stood there. I had no role, no plan. What was I supposed to do? Be the ringleader? The clown? I had no idea. But the clowns were watching, and the ringleader hadn't moved from his spot on the edge of the ring, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement. "Welcome to the greatest show on earth," I shouted, trying to sound confident. My voice wavered, but I kept going. "Strongman Kyle will now lift this mighty bench with the strength of 10 men. I waved my hand toward Kyle, who groaned as he hefted the bench above his head again. "Look at that strength," I shouted, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. The clowns didn't move. They just watched, silent, unblinking. It was the most unnerving thing I'd ever seen. Lisa, dangling awkwardly from the rope, tried to twirl a little, her feet kicking out as she spun slowly in the air. "And here's Lisa, the fearless acrobat," I called out, trying to keep the performance going. "Look at her amazing aerial skills." We were ridiculous, but we didn't stop. Every second felt like it could be our last if we messed up, so we kept playing our roles. Kyle dropped the bench and flexed his arms like he was some kind of bodybuilder. Lisa climbed a little higher and did a shaky twirl. I waved my hands around like some cheesy carnival barker, yelling about feats of strength and daring stunts. For a moment, I thought maybe this was working. The clowns weren't advancing anymore, and the ringleader was just standing there, his smile never faltering. But then I saw it. One of the clowns, the one with the hammer, started to twitch. At first, it was just a small movement, barely noticeable. But then the twitching grew, spreading through its limbs until its entire body was shaking violently. The hammer it had been dragging clattered to the ground, and the clown's head jerked to the side, its neck cracking with a sickening pop. Its wide, frozen smile seemed to stretch even further across its face, the painted-on expression twisting into something far more sinister. And that's when it lunged. Kyle barely had time to react before the clown was on him, knocking him to the ground with terrifying speed. The bench flew out of his hands, and he screamed as the clown grabbed him by the collar, lifting him off the ground with unnatural strength. "Kyle!" Lisa screamed, her voice high and panicked. I ran toward them, but I was too slow. The clown threw Kyle across the ring like he weighed nothing, and he slammed into one of the tent poles with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain, his hand clutching his side. The other clowns started moving again, slowly at first, but with purpose now. The ringleader's grin widened as he clapped his hands together, his voice ringing out through the tent. "Ah, there we are. The show must have a climax, after all." Lisa dropped from the rope, stumbling as she ran toward Kyle. "Get up, Kyle, get up," she cried, shaking him frantically. I grabbed the broken piece of what Kyle had dropped and held it out in front of me, but I knew it was useless. The clowns were advancing again, their eyes locked on us, and the ringleader was watching, his expression one of twisted delight. "We have to go," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Now!" But the clowns were too close. There was no way out. And then, without warning, the lights in the tent flickered once more. The clowns froze mid-step, and the ringleader's face darkened. The tent, which had been so suffocatingly close, suddenly seemed to shift, the walls rippling as if they were made of fabric and shadow. The ringleader's smile faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice sharp and cold. I didn't know what was happening, but I didn't care. I grabbed Kyle by the arm, pulling him to his feet, and Lisa grabbed his other side. Together, we ran. We didn't look back, didn't question it. We just ran, straight for the flaps of the tent that had sealed us in earlier. This time they opened, and we didn't stop running until the twisted circus and its monsters were far behind us. We burst through the tent flaps, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests like they were about to explode. The cold night air hit us hard, and for a moment, it felt like we had escaped. Like maybe, just maybe, we were free. But the eerie silence outside told me otherwise. It wasn't over. Kyle stumbled forward, clutching his side where he had slammed into the tent pole. His face was pale, beads of sweat dripping down his forehead. Lisa was right beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to help him stay on his feet. I could see the panic in her eyes, the same fear that was tightening my chest, but she was trying to hold it together. She always had been the strongest of us, even if she didn't believe it. I looked around, hoping to see something familiar. The road, the fairgrounds, anything, but it was like we were in a completely different place. The world outside the tent felt wrong, distorted. There was no moon, no stars, just a thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the dim light of the circus tent. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, running a hand through my hair, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "Where are we?" Kyle groaned, wincing as he tried to stand up straight. "What do you mean? We're outside, aren't we?" Lisa, her voice shaky, said what I was too afraid to admit. "Look around. This isn't the fairgrounds. We didn't leave." Not really. She was right. The air felt thick and heavy, like we were still trapped inside the nightmare, even though we had physically escaped the tent. The ground beneath our feet wasn't the gravel of the parking lot, but a cold, unfamiliar dirt that seemed to stretch on forever in all directions. And the tent? It wasn't just a tent anymore. It loomed behind us, massive and menacing, far bigger than it had been when we first entered. It seemed alive, its canvas walls shifting like they were breathing. "We're still in it," I said, realization dawning on me. "This whole place, it's part of the circus. We never really left." Lisa's eyes widened, her breath quickening. No, we got out. We ran. Kyle cut her off, his voice strained. "She's right. We're still here. It's all part of whatever sick game that Ringleader is playing." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. We hadn't escaped. We had just moved from one part of the nightmare to another. Suddenly, a low, soft laugh echoed through the darkness, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned toward the sound, and there, standing at the edge of the dim light, was the ringleader. He was still grinning, his eyes glinting with that same cruel amusement. But now, there was something darker in his expression, something more sinister. You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? His voice was like silk, smooth and cold, cutting through the night air. He stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back, as if he had all the time in the world. The show isn't over yet. Kyle staggered forward, his face twisted in anger. We did what you wanted. We performed. We played your stupid game. Let us go. The ringleader's grin widened. Oh, you played along, yes? But the performance wasn't quite up to par. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. You see, my dear guest, this circus isn't about simple tricks and acts. It's about entertainment, and I'm afraid you've barely scratched the surface. I felt my stomach drop. What are you talking about? The ringleader raised a hand, gesturing toward the tent behind us. You've only completed the first act. The real show is just beginning. His smile stretched impossibly wide, his teeth gleaming in the faint light. And you're the stars. Lisa's voice cracked with fear. Please, we just want to leave. We don't want any part of this. He sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. Oh, but you're already part of it, my dear. You've been part of it since the moment you stepped through those gates. There's no turning back now. Kyle, his face pale but determined, took a step toward him. We'll fight our way out if we have to, he said through gritted teeth, though I could tell he didn't believe it. We're not staying here. The ringleader laughed again, a deep, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. Fight? Oh, my boy. There's no fighting your way out of this. This isn't a place you can escape through brute force. No, no. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The only way out is to finish the show, and you're far from finished. I looked around, my heart sinking. The darkness pressed in on us, thick and impenetrable. I could hear faint whispers now, echoing from somewhere deep in the shadows, like the voices of the audience we couldn't see but knew were there, waiting, watching. We need to keep going, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kyle turned to me, incredulous. Are you serious? You want to keep playing his game? That's exactly what he wants. We don't have a choice, I said, my voice steady even though I was terrified. We're trapped here. If we don't finish this, we're never getting out. It's the only way. Lisa wiped the tears from her face, her hands shaking. But what does that mean? Finish what? What more do they want? The ringleader took a step back, spreading his arms wide. That's for you to figure out. Every good show needs a grand finale, after all. He smirked, his eyes glinting in the darkness. I suggest you prepare yourselves. The next act is about to begin. And just like that, he was gone. One moment he was standing there, grinning like the devil, and the next, the darkness swallowed him whole. The only thing left was the oppressive silence and the weight of what he had said. I turned to Kyle and Lisa, my mind racing. We were trapped in a game we didn't understand, surrounded by forces we couldn't fight, and the only way out was to finish whatever twisted performance the ringleader had planned for us. But what did that mean? What more could he want from us? We need to stick together, I said, try to keep my voice steady. Whatever happens next, we can't let them split us up. That's how we survive this. Kyle nodded, his face pale but determined. Yeah, we're not playing by his rules anymore. We do this our way. Lisa looked at me, her eyes filled with fear, but also a flicker of hope. Do you really think we can get out of this? I didn't know the answer, but I had to believe we could. We had to keep moving forward, keep pushing through the nightmare. If we gave into the fear, we were done for. Yes, I said, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. We're getting out. We're going to finish this, and then we're leaving. All of us. I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, them or myself. And with that, we turned our backs on the looming tent and stepped deeper into the darkness, knowing that whatever was waiting for us in the next act, it was going to be worse than anything we'd faced so far. The darkness felt endless as we walked further away from the tent, but there was no escaping the feeling that it was still right behind us, like it was breathing down our necks, waiting for us to slip up. The ground beneath our feet was soft, almost like sand, and the air was thick and stale, as though this place hadn't seen the light of day in years, maybe even centuries. Kyle limped beside me, his face twisted in pain, but he didn't say a word. Lisa was quieter than I'd ever seen her, her eyes darting around, wide and fearful, like she was waiting for something to jump out from the shadows at any second. And honestly, so was I. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of a clearing. The ground opened up into a wide circle, and in the center was something I wasn't expecting: a stage. It was small, old-fashioned, like one of those makeshift stages you'd see at a traveling carnival. There were spotlights positioned around it, casting an eerie glow on the wooden platform, and sitting on top of it, in a perfect little row, were 3 chairs. Just waiting for us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew, without a doubt, this was where we were supposed to go. We're not seriously going up there, are we? Kyle muttered, looking at the stage like it was some kind of execution platform. I shook my head. I don't think we have a choice. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. What do you think happens if we don't? I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't want to know what happened if we refused. Every instinct told me that staying here, standing on the edge of whatever this was, would only make things worse. The ringleader's voice echoed in my head. The only way out is to finish the show. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to step forward. The stage creaked under my weight as I climbed the steps, the wood old and splintered. Kyle and Lisa followed, their footsteps just as hesitant as mine. The air was thick with anticipation, like something big was about to happen, but none of us knew what it would be. We sat down in the chairs, the wood cold and hard against our backs. For a moment, nothing happened. We just sat there, staring out into the darkness, waiting. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken fear that this was it, the final act. But what kind of twisted finale could they have in store for us? Then, from somewhere in the shadows, a soft, rhythmic sound began. At first, I couldn't place it, but as it grew louder, I realized what it was: applause. Slow, deliberate clapping, like an audience watching us from the darkness, waiting for us to do something. Lisa's eyes widened. "Who's clapping?" she whispered, gripping the sides of her chair, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Kyle glanced around, his face pale. "There's no one here, right?" But the applause continued, growing louder with each passing second. And then, as if summoned by the sound, the ringleader appeared. He stepped into the light, his grin wider than ever, his black coat billowing out behind him as he walked. His eyes locked on us, gleaming with excitement, like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Welcome to the grand finale," he said, his voice smooth and theatrical, like an announcer at the end of a long-awaited show. "You've made it this far, and for that, you should be proud." Not many do. Kyle stood up abruptly, his face twisted with anger. "We played your game. We did what you wanted. Let us go." The ringleader chuckled softly, shaking his head. But you haven't completed the show yet, have you? The performance isn't over until the final act is played. What more do you want from us?" Lisa cried, her voice breaking with desperation. "We've done everything you asked. Just let us go." The ringleader's smile never faltered. All performances must have a conclusion, an ending that satisfies the audience. He gestured toward the darkness around us, and I realized that the clapping had stopped. The air was thick with silence now, as if the unseen audience was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. And now, it's time for the final act. Suddenly, the lights around the stage dimmed, and a low, haunting melody began to play. It was the kind of music you'd hear at an old carnival, slow and distorted, like a music box that had been left out in the rain for too long. The stage beneath us creaked, and before I could react, the chairs we were sitting in started to move. Kyle shot up, his face panicked. "What the?" But it was too late. The chairs were no longer just chairs. They were part of the stage itself, moving on their own, pulling us toward the center. I grabbed the arms of my chair, tried to fight it, but the force was too strong. The stage seemed to stretch and warp, pulling us deeper into the center of the clearing, as if we were being swallowed by the ground itself. Lisa screamed, trying to pull herself free, but the chair held her in place. Kyle was thrashing against the force, but it was no use. We were being pulled into something I couldn't see, but could feel all around me. The stage was alive, and it wanted us. The ringleader's voice echoed over the music, smooth and unbothered. You wanted to be part of the show, didn't you? Well, here you are, the stars of the greatest performance in the world. As the chairs dragged us into the center, the shadows around us seemed to close in. I could hear the audience again. Faint whispers, muttering and murmuring from the darkness, like they were watching, waiting, judging. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the chairs stopped moving. The music cut off, and the silence returned, heavier than ever. The ringleader stood in front of us, his grin sharp and cold. And now, the final choice. Every show must have a conclusion. After all, my heart pounded in my chest. What choice? I asked, my voice trembling. He gestured toward the shadows. One of you must stay. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? His smile widened. The circus must have its performers, and one of you must remain as part of the act. He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. The others may go, but one of you will stay behind to entertain the audience. Forever. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Stay behind? Forever? This was the final act. One of us was going to be trapped here, in this nightmare, while the others escaped. Kyle shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. No way. We're all getting out of here. The ringleader's grin faltered for just a moment. Oh, but you must choose. If you don't, none of you will leave. Lisa's face crumpled. This isn't fair. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me, crushing me. How could we choose? How could we possibly decide who would stay behind in this twisted, endless circus? The ringleader stepped back, his voice soft but final. The choice is yours. For what felt like an eternity, none of us spoke. The weight of the decision hung in the air like a noose, tightening around us with every passing second. Then, without warning, Kyle stood up. His face was pale, his eyes dark with resignation. I'll do it. Lisa gasped. No, Kyle, you can't. But he raised his hand, cutting her off. It's the only way. One of us has to stay, and I'm not letting either of you get trapped here. You two get out. I'll handle it. My heart twisted in my chest. Kyle, no. But he just shook his head, forcing a weak smile. I got us into this mess. Let me get you out. Before we could stop him, he stepped forward toward the ringleader. The shadows seemed to close in around him, swallowing him up as he walked. The ringleader's grin widened again, and he bowed slightly, like a gentleman greeting a guest. Very well, the ringleader said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. The show must go on. Kyle turned back to us, his face filled with a strange, sad peace. Go, now, before it's too late. Lisa was sobbing, shaking her head, but she didn't move. I couldn't believe what was happening, but I knew there was no stopping it. The ringleader clapped his hands, and the stage began to collapse around us. The shadows shifted, and the tent, that terrible, monstrous tent, reappeared in the distance, its flaps wide open, waiting for us to leave. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her with me as we ran toward the tent, toward the exit. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As we crossed through the flaps, the world outside exploded into light. The real world. The parking lot, the night sky, the stars. They were all there, waiting for us. We were free, but Kyle wasn't. The tent behind us collapsed into itself, vanishing in the blink of an eye. And with it, Kyle was gone. The circus was over. But I knew, deep down, that somewhere that tent still existed. And Kyle would be there, performing for an audience that never stopped watching. The show would go on, and it always would.